On the morning of February 14, 1929, on North Clark Street in Chicago, a thin layer of snow covered the sidewalk, and the breath of passers-by dissolved into the gray winter air. In front of a red brick garage, a few men stood with their shoulders hunched in their coats, checking their watches. They were waiting for something everyone in the country knew was illegal, but still tried every way to obtain: liquor in the Prohibition era. Inside the garage, the smell of gasoline and cigarettes, the sound of shoes on the concrete floor, and cups of coffee brought over from the corner shop created the familiar atmosphere of a shady deal, where people traded a few short sentences while listening for the sound of cars out on the street. The screech of brakes rang out. A car that looked like a police car stopped in front. Several men in uniform walked in, their voices short and cold. "Face the wall. Hands up." The men in the garage complied, thinking this was an inspection, a bit of harassment that an envelope could take care of. A few seconds later, what rang out was not the rustle of papers or threats, but the rattle of machine guns slamming into the brick wall. When the gun smoke cleared, 7 bodies lay on the concrete floor, none of them having had time to reach for the gun in their coat pocket. Far to the south, in Florida, Al Capone was enjoying the warm sunshine. He had an alibi. No court could conclude that he had directly ordered the massacre. But for the people of Chicago and the remaining gangs, the choice of targets, the use of a police disguise, the way an ordinary morning was turned into a message written in bullets, were enough for them to understand who was speaking. From that cold brick garage on North Clark, the image of Chicago in the eyes of the entire country changed color. The city of factories and immigrant neighborhoods would now also be remembered as the place where 7 bodies on a concrete floor pushed their way to the top of the morning news. At the center of that picture, the name Al Capone became the symbol for an entire era in which Chicago was known by a very cold phrase: the crime capital of America. When the gunshots in the North Clark garage were still echoing in memory, it was necessary to take a step back and look at the broader picture of America at that time. In the early 1920s, after the 18th Amendment and the Volstead Act came into effect, the United States officially entered the Prohibition era. On paper, the whole country stepped into a new moral age. But in diners, in family kitchens, at baseball games, Americans still raised their glasses. The law said no, habit said yes. The gap between those two words was exactly where the black market was born. Chicago was one of the places where that gap widened the fastest. It was a city of factories, railroads, slaughterhouses, where waves of immigrants from Europe poured in looking for work in cramped neighborhoods. By day, it was shifts in the factories. By night, it was the need to forget the fatigue with a drink, a card game, a bit of noise. In a city like that, if the official state withdrew from the realm of entertainment, someone was going to fill the gap, and they did not wear the suits of public officials. Politically, Chicago operated in the way Americans call a political machine. Votes, contracts, and positions were traded in closed meeting rooms where money and relationships mattered as much as written law. Mayor William Hale Thompson, nicknamed Big Bill, was known both for his populism and for his willingness to turn a blind eye to bootlegging if it brought support and campaign funding. When the leadership sent the signal that prohibition was something that existed on paper, down on the streets, everything played out exactly that way. In that context, men like Johnny Torrio and later Al Capone did not appear as people breaking the order, but as service providers for a city that was deceiving itself. Capone was born in Brooklyn in an Italian immigrant family, his father a barber and his mother a housewife. He dropped out of school early, grew up among cheap bars and street gangs, and carried on his face the scar from a brawl that the press later turned into the nickname Scarface. From roles as enforcer, bouncer, errand man, he learned the language of violence and understood that in poor neighborhoods, fists and guns often spoke louder than the law. Around 1919, when Torrio summoned Capone to Chicago, the destination was not lecture halls or offices, but speakeasies behind locked doors, brothels, gambling joints, all of them living off the fact that liquor was banned in public. Chicago at that time was the intersection of three layers: a prohibition law that society did not really want to obey, a city where politics and crime could shake hands if both sides profited, and a poor immigrant class in which a young man like Al Capone understood that the road from the starting line to power would run through smoke-filled bars, not through the official corridors of power. From that ground, a criminal empire could grow without much need for explanation. In 1925, when Johnny Torrio was ambushed and almost killed, he understood that it was time to leave the stage. The man who had built the bootlegging empire in Chicago stepped back into the shadows and handed everything over to his youngest, most ambitious right-hand man. Al Capone, only 26 years old, suddenly became the man holding the keys to the network of speakeasies, brothels, gambling dens, illegal breweries, and warehouses spread across the city. From a collector and fixer, he rose to the position of the man who set the rules for an entire illegal industry. Seen from a distance, that empire could easily be mistaken for a jumble of bars, girls, cards, and gun gangs. But inside, Capone ran it as a clearly structured three-tier business model. The first layer was the product. Liquor flowed steadily into the speakeasies, the gambling dens stayed open late into the night, the brothels operated steadily, and every drink, every hand of cards, every party was recorded in ledgers that were never sent to the tax authorities. The second layer was the infrastructure. Breweries operated in warehouse districts, trucks, boats, and storage depots were scattered all over Chicago, along with drivers, gunmen, and couriers who kept the flow of goods from being cut off. The third layer was the insurance layer. Police officers took envelopes to forget certain addresses. Judges handed down light sentences. Lawyers looked for loopholes. Politicians in need of campaign funds knew very well the path to Capone's envelopes. On such a foundation, cash became the first pillar in Capone's formula. Prohibition turned every bottle of liquor into a commodity with enormous profit margins. The cash flowed in so fast that it was impossible to launder it all, but enough to buy silence, buy loyalty, and buy prestige in places where the official state had already lost it. The second pillar was violence, but not random violence. Capone did not need to pull the trigger himself in every hit. What he needed was a clear message. Any bar that did not buy his liquor could be bombed. Any rival who ignored the warning could be erased from the street. In Chicago, people quickly understood the meaning of staying inside the system, or becoming the example for others to look at. The third pillar was image. Capone understood that in a poor city, a boss could become the neighborhood hero if he knew how to redistribute at the right moment. He appeared in sharp suits, smiled at reporters, paid hospital bills for acquaintances, and opened soup kitchens for the unemployed in the early years of the Depression. For many residents in poor neighborhoods, they did not see the accounting ledgers or the bodies from gang wars. They saw the man who had helped them pay a hospital bill or given them a hot meal. The mix of violence behind closed doors and generosity on the street created a kind of power that was very hard to challenge. At this point, Al Capone was no longer just a gangster who had risen in the Prohibition era. He had turned Chicago into a testing ground for a form of modern organized crime, where the boundaries between business, politics, and armed intimidation were blended together. That blueprint, with its 3 operating tiers and 3 pillars of power, would later be repeated in many other places, under many other names. But a machine built on forbidden money and violence cannot run without spilling out onto the streets. And Chicago was about to enter years in which the sound of machine guns became the city's background rhythm. In the years when Capone's empire was at its height, Chicagoans learned to recognize one another, not only by their neighborhood or favorite baseball team, but by the gunfire they had grown used to hearing. The beer wars, the struggle between gangs over bootlegging routes, turned many streets into invisible boundaries. After dark, the sound of Thompson submachine guns could erupt at any moment on some street corner, spraying bullets through windows, car bodies, brick walls. A driver who took the wrong route, a bar owner who bought from the wrong liquor source, a loyal henchman of a rival gang, any of them could become the next body. In the newspapers, the numbers were listed dryly. Hundreds of gang-related killings every year. But for ordinary people, what they remembered was not the statistics, but the small details. A child jolting awake in the night at the sound of a burst of gunfire instead of fireworks. A mother pulling her child away from the window when she heard a car screech to a halt in the alley. A locksmith asking customers whether their neighborhood had been quiet the previous night, as if the weather had turned into another kind of storm. The Valentine's Day Massacre was only one high point in that chain of violence. 7 bodies lay in the red brick garage, but the real weight fell on the sense of safety of the entire city. The next morning, people opened the papers, turned on the radio, and listened to the details as if they were hearing news of a war in some distant place. Except this time, the location was a street they knew, an area they had walked through. Many could not remember all the victims' names, but everyone clearly remembered the feeling that the rules of the game had changed. If the elimination of rivals could be staged so meticulously, then whom should the person caught between the two sides trust? Then the violence did not stop at speakeasies or gambling dens. It walked straight into the polling stations. In the 1928 primary, what Chicago history calls the pineapple primary, steel pineapples, grenades, were thrown near polling places. Candidates bold enough to stand up against corruption could be chased down and shot in the street. Voters going to the polls did not just worry about choosing the wrong person. They worried about choosing the wrong place to stand before they heard an explosion. When a boss is powerful enough to threaten the electoral process itself, crime is no longer a parallel world. It touches the very heart of local democracy. At the everyday level, all of that translated into unspoken rules. Parents told their children to avoid certain streets after school. Corner shop owners closed earlier than usual when they heard 2 gangs were on edge, accepting the loss of a bit of revenue in exchange for a sense of safety. People learned not to say certain names out loud in diners or on streetcars, knowing that the walls had ears. Those small changes accumulated, turning the atmosphere of the entire city into a thin but ever-present layer of tension. When the press called Chicago the crime capital of America, many thought it was just a sensational label. But for those who lived there in those years, that phrase accurately described a state of life. A place where every daily decision, from which route to take to work to where to sit in a bar, had to be weighed under the shadow of guns and of names everyone knew but few dared to mention. By that point, not only ordinary citizens but also the press and civil organizations understood that if the state did not find a way to strike at the roots, Chicago would continue to be defined by an outlaw. For many years, the American press not only condemned but also unintentionally helped build the image of Al Capone as a boss who was both brutal and flashy. Pinstriped suits, cigars, luxury cars, photographs of him stepping out of court with a half smile. For a segment of the public, that was almost the image of a dark star of the Prohibition era. But after the shootings, and especially the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, the mood gradually shifted. The Chicago Crime Commission publicly called Capone public enemy number 1. That line in the newspaper was like an admission that if the state did nothing, the city would continue to be defined by a man outside the law. The problem was that the state had tried many times to do something, and failed. Murder cases rarely led to convictions. Witnesses were afraid, juries could be threatened or bribed, and the police were not always on one side. At this point, the federal government began to change the question. Instead of asking whether Capone had pulled the trigger, they asked something simpler. Where did a man with no declared income get the money to buy mansions, luxury cars, jewelry, and lavish parties? In the quiet offices of the tax agency, people who carried not guns but calculators and pencils began to go through every invoice, every ledger, every expense. They compared the extravagant spending with tax returns that were blank or did not exist. It was not a spectacular chase in the streets. It was long nights beside columns of numbers, beside income tax law, beside the belief that if you could not prove the blood, you could still prove the money. In October 1931, Al Capone was brought to court not for murder, but for tax evasion. The sentence of 11 years in federal prison for a man who had once thought himself above the law was the first blow that truly struck the body of the system. In the years that followed, in federal prison and then on Alcatraz, Capone was cut off from his network, from the dining rooms where he had once given orders, and from the layer of image the press had once painted for him. The syphilis left untreated since his youth began to attack his nervous system, causing his memory and personality to deteriorate. A man who had once made an entire city hold its breath now had to stand in line for his ration like any other inmate. The machine bearing Capone's name did not, in the end, break because he ran out of money or because of one last shootout in the street. It broke because of a different kind of rot, more silent, arising from the very lines of law he had thought applied only to other people. From ledgers, from invoices, from numbers that seemed lifeless, but were powerful enough to pull a crime icon down from the position of public enemy number one to his proper place as a man who had to pay the price before the law. After Capone was convicted and Prohibition ended in 1933, Chicago gradually changed. Laws on organized crime tightened, subordinate gangs were broken up, and many bootlegging routes disappeared. But the memories of the machine gun years did not go away. They lay in the way adults told their children and grandchildren about the streets that once had to be avoided, about the nights when they heard a car stop outside the door and held their breath to see whether it was friend or foe. They lay in the way people mentioned the name Capone, both as a proper name and as the name of an entire era. From that story, there are a few very brief points that are hard to ignore. When something is banned on paper, but everyone keeps using it, there will always be someone who builds an empire out of that gray zone. When politics accepts dirty money in exchange for votes and power, crime no longer stands outside the state, but sits at the same table with it. And when violence only touches other people, other neighborhoods, society very easily shrugs until the day it knocks on one's own door. By then, it is too late. TerrorFiles retells stories like Al Capone's not to write more gangster legend, but to identify dangerous formulas that can return with a different face, in a different city. This video only aims to analyze and stand on the side of the victims, not to promote or romanticize any organization or act of violence. If any detail in this episode reminds you of the present, please leave a comment. Subscribe to the channel and share the video if you think these stories should not be buried in the Old Stories of America section. That is how the lessons from Chicago almost a century ago still have a chance to echo in today's debates.